our children today, if I cannot statistically prove this, but it's almost like they don't recognize, I don't know whether this is fair to say this or not, the richness in the rhythm of our language. Even our different languages in Fiji differs, but the weight and the accentuation put into these words, that's why I always, if you recognize my meke, it's all in my language. It's not in Bau. If you go around the village today and any part of Fiji, you hardly can hear people singing a meke. They will all sing Boy George song, Beyonce. Yeah, that shows how powerful the media has exposed. And I think for me the question is for Fiji, how much are you doing about your own music? You see, music today is all program music, but in terms of having to teach, to allow for the teaching of traditional music, the only solution is to bring traditional Doni Voodoo, to be able to teach to these students in a bigger scale. But in small scale, then you will be confined to the descendants of these people going this way. And at one stage, it will fall. The question between Western music and meke, traditional dance, is where do they weigh their likings? Where do they weigh their liking? Do they really enjoy or appreciate theirs because it's the Western music, because it's so new? And maybe because the traditional music is not so exposed as much as the Western music today.
Education has failed Pacific Island people simply because we haven't contextualized it. In education, there is this concept called the culture gap. And the idea fascinated me when I was an undergrad student. Konai, Professor Thayman, introduced us to this idea of the culture gap that was first introduced by an English professor, Angela Little. And according to Angela Little, the culture gap refers to the difference in expectations between the home culture and the school culture. So if the home culture is very similar to the school culture, the child is more likely to succeed. And there is a very small culture gap, because the expectations of the home are similar or the same to the expectations of the school. When the child comes from a culture that is very different to the culture of the school, then that child will struggle. And that's called the culture gap. And sometimes the culture gap is small and sometimes the culture gap is large. And so the argument behind addressing the culture gap is recognizing what needs to be done. And so over the years, a lot of indigenous scholars all over the world have engaged in research attempting to bridge the culture gap. What are the factors that enable indigenous students to succeed? Because many do succeed. But what needs to change? Our greatest challenge in the Pacific today, and the greatest challenge to Pacific arts, Pacific culture, and Pacific studies, is our own people in power, who don't value it, who don't see the value. So we would much rather promote e-learning, because that's where the world is going, as opposed to creating something that is relevant and meaningful to our own people. Because we will not get global recognition for it. Our people will value it, but you won't get those accolades or whatever globally. And so seeking funding for an art project, no matter how useful it is, just doesn't seem of worth.
What does formal education allow that you think traditional education doesn't?
Okay. I think for me, formal education allows the sharing of what people don't know about, what is deeply captured within the traditional, the realm of dance, of the meke. That is the beauty of formal education. So it's almost like, okay, this medium is prevalent across the globe. So why not just having to bring our culture, our dance, putting into to this mode, and have everybody to know it, rather than having to be confined within the traditional framework and die down one day. Because the taboo the taboos will, I think it will just be passed on to the descendants of the Ndoni Voodoo. So I'm afraid to say that probably will be passed on with it the same descendants. But if we so love and we care about our dance and our tradition and our culture, then we have to use formal education to be the vehicle for this. And for me, it will be unfair for a person like us who have already been, enlightened by what people need to know, to not say these things. We are doing injustice to the future generations.
A lot of scholars and practitioners on the ground, working in the communities, actually recognize that because of globalization and the way that the world has become, there really is no turning back. And in reality, we don't really know what our cultures were like 100 years ago. We think we know because of that limited cultural memory that has been passed on. But with every generation, our cultural practice is reduced. And so the cultural memory of every generation is less than the previous one. So what was before? Our understanding is quite different to what it might actually have been. So a lot of us actually recognize that the only way forward is a blended approach, where you take the best from both. You try to figure out what's not working in formal education or schooling, and you try to bring in relevant aspects of the home community or the cultural community or indigenous knowledge to enrich that learning experience that allows young people to thrive. What we're doing right now is preparing them to sometimes survive, not thrive. Like doing well is not actually one of the outcomes.